Economist.
May 1st to May 7th, 2021.
Word for word, the articles from this week's edition of The Economist, including...
From the Leaders section, Superpower Politics, the most dangerous place on Earth.
From the International section, Diplomacy Disrupted, the Zoom where it happens.
From the Science and Technology section, Post-COVID Syndrome, the sting in the tail.
The World This Week. Politics.
India's second wave of COVID-19 gained strength. The number of infections detected hit new records, with some 380,000 on April the 28th alone. The official death toll surpassed 200,000, though evidence grew that many more fatalities are going unrecorded. Shortages of beds and oxygen afflicted many hospitals. The government ordered Twitter to remove posts critical of its handling of the epidemic, sparking widespread outrage. India now accounts for around 40% of the world's new recorded infections. An Indonesian general died in a shootout with separatists in Papua province in Indonesia's half of the island of New Guinea. Gusti Putu Dani Karya Nugraha was the first Indonesian general ever to be killed in action. Fighters from the Karen National Liberation Army, an insurgent group, captured an outpost on the Thai border from the Burmese army. Several rebel groups have taken advantage of the chaos in Myanmar to seize territory. China began construction of an orbiting space station with the launch of Tianhe, Harmony of the Heavens, the first of 3 planned modules. When finished in 2022, the station will be a fifth the size of the existing International Space Station. Leaks from last year's census suggested that China's population has started to shrink earlier than the Communist Party had hoped or expected. Official media denied the leaks but added details that appeared to support them. The Census Bureau reported that America's population stood at 331.4 million on April the 1st, 2020. That was an increase of 7.4% since 2010, the slowest rate of decennial growth since the Depression. Texas gained 4 million people, the most of any state. Utah's population grew the most in percentage terms, 18%. California remains the most populous state, but it will lose a congressional seat for the first time ever. California's Governor Gavin Newsom will probably face an election to recall him from office later this year, after a conservative-driven petition to remove him gathered enough signatures to qualify for the ballot. Joe Biden used the 106th anniversary of atrocities committed by Turkey against Armenians during the First World War to define them as genocide, the first time an American president has formally done so. More than 1 million Armenians were deported or died at the hands of the Ottomans. Turkey protested, but its reaction was less intense than some had feared. Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, laid out his government's plans for rebuilding the economy after COVID in the form of a €248 billion or $300 billion spending package. Almost all the money will come from the EU, which has imposed some tough reform conditions. Fulfilling them will be tricky. Hungary passed a law to hand control of state universities to foundations. These are likely to be run by ruling party supporters who can appoint their successors. This arrangement cannot be changed without a 2/3 majority in Parliament. Critics griped that the ruling party had, in effect, given itself permanent control of higher education. Arlene Foster said she would step down as Northern Ireland's First Minister or Premier in June following a revolt against her leadership in her Democratic Unionist Party. Its members have become increasingly agitated by the post-Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, which in effect creates a border for goods crossing from mainland Britain. Somalia's president promised to reverse legislation that would extend his term in office by 2 years after fighting broke out in the capital, Mogadishu. Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed was supposed to have stepped down in February. More than 80 people were killed when a fire caused by an oxygen cylinder erupted at a hospital treating COVID-19 patients in Baghdad. In a leaked audio tape, Muhammad Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, said that the Revolutionary Guard dictates foreign policy and took Iran into Syria's civil war at the urging of Russia. He also said that Russia tried to stop Iran from agreeing to a nuclear deal in 2015. Talks to revive the deal, which America ditched in 2018, resumed in Vienna. In Israel, Benny Gantz, the leader of the Blue and White Party, was appointed justice minister after Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, tried to slide a member of his own party, Likud, into the position. Mr. Netanyahu's move was deemed illegal by the Attorney General as it violated the coalition agreement with Mr. Gantz. The appointment is a sensitive issue. Mr. Netanyahu is on trial for corruption. Israel recorded no new daily COVID-19 deaths for the first time in 10 months. Thousands of people took to the streets in Colombia to protest against a controversial tax reform. In the city of Cali, a 1 p.m. curfew was put in place after several buses were burned. Trade union leaders who have been organizing the protests called for another gathering in May.
Coronavirus briefs.
Japan declared a state of emergency in Tokyo and 3 other prefectures. Unlike previous restrictions, bars selling alcohol and shopping malls were told to close. Chile will keep its borders closed for another month, even though the number of new COVID-19 cases is easing. America's Centers for Disease Control revised its advice on wearing masks. Fully vaccinated people do not need to wear one outside, it said, except in crowded venues like sports stadiums. Americans were allowed to receive the one-shot Johnson & Johnson jab again after regulators ended their suspension of the vaccine. They had been investigating claims that it caused blood clots. America said it would donate up to 60 million doses of the AstraZeneca jab to other countries. The vaccine has not been approved for use in the U.S.
The World This Week. Business.
In a speech to a joint session of Congress, Joe Biden laid out his American Families Plan, the most ambitious attempt to expand social programs since the 1960s. The plan includes universal childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds, a family leave initiative, and tuition-free community college. The $1.8 trillion price tag will be paid in part by increasing the top rate of income tax to 39.6%. And for those earning over $1 million, taxes on capital gains and dividends will soar. The family of Lee Kun-hee, Samsung's late chairman, are to pay almost $11 billion in taxes on his estate, one of the world's biggest ever inheritance tax bills. His art collection, which includes works by Salvador Dali, Claude Monet and Pablo Picasso, will be donated to the National Museum of Korea and other institutions. The Ethiopian government's auction of 2 licenses to operate telecoms was deemed a failure when only 2 bidders submitted offers. The sale of the licenses was supposed to be the jewel in the privatization drive under Abiy Ahmed, the reform-minded prime minister. Potential buyers were put off by some of the restrictions, such as excluding foreign telecoms from providing mobile money services. Total, a French oil and gas company, suspended work indefinitely on a $20 billion liquefied natural gas project in Mozambique, Africa's largest energy investment, because of attacks by jihadists. Total evacuated its staff from the town of Palma in March. Apple had a bumper first quarter. Revenues soared to $89.6 billion, as did net profit to $23.6 billion. That is more than Amazon's profit for all of last year. The tech company recorded big increases in sales of iPhones, iPads and other devices, confounding the market narrative that it is increasingly reliant on services, apps, TV and the like, for growth. Huawei's revenues fell by 16.5% in the first quarter, year-on-year, the second consecutive quarter in which it has registered a hefty drop. The Chinese maker of telecoms equipment was banned from having access to some American technology under the Trump administration, which is putting its business under immense pressure. China's competition regulator launched an investigation into Meituan, a shopping platform for food, entertainment and other lifestyle services. It is the latest antitrust action taken against a tech giant in China, coming soon after Alibaba was fined $2.8 billion for abusing its market power. Lyft has followed Uber in giving up the development of autonomous vehicles. The ride-hailing company sold its self-driving cars unit to Toyota. It will be integrated into the Japanese carmaker's Woven Planet division, which is on a mission of mobility to love. Tesla's sales revved up in the first 3 months of 2021, increasing by 74% over the same quarter last year, despite problems in obtaining semiconductors for its electric cars. The company reported net income of $438 million, its best quarterly profit to date. Panasonic made its biggest ever foreign acquisition when it agreed to buy the 80% of Blue Yonder it doesn't already own in a deal valued at $7.1 billion. Blue Yonder specializes in software for supply chain management. More banks disclosed losses from their exposure to the collapse of Archegos, an investment fund. Nomura took a hit of over $2.9 billion, more than it had estimated previously, dragging the Japanese bank to its worst quarterly performance since 2008. UBS recorded a $774 million loss in operating income related to Archegos, overshadowing the Swiss bank's solid quarterly profit. By contrast, Deutsche Bank said it had managed to sell its assets in Archegos before it imploded, avoiding any associated damage to its balance sheet. The German bank made a net profit of €908 million, that's $1.1 billion, in the first quarter, its best since the start of 2014. In one of the firmest commitments to getting workers back into the office, JP Morgan Chase told staff that it wants them to return to their place of employment by early July, albeit on a rotational basis to comply with a 50% cap on office occupancy. The bank recognised that for some people, returning to the office is a change you'll need to manage. It also encouraged staff to get vaccinated, but said this would not be a requirement for entering the office. Loved and loathed in equal measure, sales of Crocs footwear have rebounded, growing by 64% in the first quarter year-on-year and producing a comfortable profit for the company. The shoes, a cross between a foam clog and a hospital sandal, have benefited from the trend towards cosy wear during the pandemic. Affirming that it's okay to go out in your slippers, they were also seen on the Oscars red carpet.
Leaders.
The Economist, May 1st to May 7th, 2021. In the Leaders section, Superpower Politics, the most dangerous place on earth. Long COVID, and now for the aftershock. Hybrid diplomacy, the virtue of virtual, and more.
Leaders.
The most dangerous place on earth. How to avoid war over the future of Taiwan.
The test of a first-rate intelligence, wrote F. Scott Fitzgerald, is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. For decades, just such an exercise of high-caliber ambiguity has kept the peace between America and China over Taiwan, an island of 24 million people, 100 miles, that's 160 kilometers, off China's coast. Leaders in Beijing say there is only one China, which they run, and that Taiwan is a rebellious part of it. America nods to the one China idea, but has spent 70 years ensuring there are two. Today, however, this strategic ambiguity is breaking down. The United States is coming to fear that it may no longer be able to deter China from seizing Taiwan by force. Admiral Phil Davidson, who heads the Indo-Pacific Command, told Congress in March that he worried about China attacking Taiwan as soon as 2027. War would be a catastrophe, and not only because of the bloodshed in Taiwan and the risk of escalation between two nuclear powers. One reason is economic. The island lies at the heart of the semiconductor industry. TSMC, the world's most valuable chip maker, etches 84% of the most advanced chips. Were production at TSMC to stop, so would the global electronics industry, at incalculable cost. The firm's technology and know-how are perhaps a decade ahead of its rivals, and it will take many years of work before either America or China can hope to catch up. The bigger reason is that Taiwan is an arena for the rivalry between China and America. Although the United States is not treaty-bound to defend Taiwan, a Chinese assault would be a test of America's military might and its diplomatic and political resolve. If the Seventh Fleet failed to turn up, China would overnight become the dominant power in Asia. America's allies around the world would know that they could not count on it. Pax Americana would collapse. To understand how to avoid conflict in the Taiwan Strait, start with the contradictions that have kept the peace during the past few decades. The government in Beijing insists it has a duty to bring about unification, even, as a last resort, by means of invasion. The Taiwanese, who used to agree that their island was part of China, albeit a non-communist one, have taken to electing governments that stress its separateness while stopping short of declaring independence. And America has protected Taiwan from Chinese aggression, even though it recognizes the government in Beijing. These opposing ideas are bundled into what Fitzgerald's diplomatic inheritors blithely call the status quo. In fact, it is a roiling, seething source of neuroses and doubt. What has changed of late is America's perception of a tipping point in China's cross-strait military build-up, 25 years in the making. The Chinese Navy has launched 90 major ships and submarines in the past 5 years, 4 to 5 times as many as America has in the Western Pacific. China builds over 100 advanced fighter planes each year. It has deployed space weapons and is bristling with precision missiles that can hit Taiwan, US Navy vessels, and American bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam. In the war games that simulate a Chinese attack on Taiwan, America has started to lose. Some American analysts conclude that military superiority will sooner or later tempt China into using force against Taiwan, not as a last resort, but because it can. China has talked itself into believing that America wants to keep the Taiwan crisis boiling and may even want a war to contain China's rise. It has trampled the idea that Hong Kong has a separate system of government, devaluing a similar offer designed to win over the people of Taiwan to peaceful unification. In the South China Sea, it has been converting barren reefs into military bases. Although China has clearly become more authoritarian and nationalistic, this analysis is too pessimistic, perhaps because hostility to China is becoming the default in America. Xi Jinping, China's president, has not even begun to prepare his people for a war likely to inflict mass casualties and economic pain on all sides. In its 100th year, the Communist Party is building its claim to power on prosperity, stability, and China's status in its region and growing role in the world. All that would be jeopardized by an attack whose result, whatever the US Navy says, comes with lots of uncertainty attached, not least over how to govern a rebellious Taiwan. Why would Mr. Xi risk it all now when China could wait until the odds are even better? Yet that brings only some comfort. Nobody in America can really know what Mr. Xi intends today, let alone what he or his successor may want in the future. China's impatience is likely to grow. Mr. Xi's appetite for risk may sharpen, especially if he wants unification with Taiwan to crown his legacy. If they are to ensure that war remains too much of a gamble for China, America and Taiwan need to think ahead. Work to re-establish an equilibrium across the Taiwan Strait will take years. Taiwan must start to devote fewer resources to big, expensive weapons systems that are vulnerable to Chinese missiles and more to tactics and technologies that would frustrate an invasion. America requires weapons to deter China from launching an amphibious invasion. It must prepare its allies, including Japan and South Korea, and it needs to communicate to China that its battle plans are credible. This will be a tricky balance to strike. Deterrence usually strives to be crystal clear about retaliation. The message here is more subtle. China must be discouraged from trying to change Taiwan's status by force, even as it is reassured that America will not support a dash for formal independence by Taiwan. The risk of a superpower arms race is high. Be under no illusions how hard it is to sustain ambiguity. Hawks in Washington and Beijing will always be able to portray it as weakness. And yet, seemingly useful shows of support for Taiwan, such as American warships making port calls on the island, could be misread as a dangerous shift in intentions. Most disputes are best put to rest. Those that can be resolved only in war can often be put off and, as China's late leader Deng Xiaoping said, left to wiser generations. Nowhere presents such a test of statesmanship as the most dangerous place on earth.
Leaders.
Long COVID. And now for the aftershock. Evidence is mounting that long COVID is a real threat to global health.
As the world enters the second year of the pandemic, two crises are unfolding. The more urgent and visible one is in poor countries like India, where a surge of COVID-19 cases is threatening to overwhelm the state. India is recording more than 350,000 cases a day, and many more than that are thought to be going undetected. The suffering is grievous. Oxygen supplies at Indian hospitals are running far short of what is needed, and crematoriums are overwhelmed. The other crisis is more subtle. This is long COVID, which is becoming apparent in rich countries like America, Britain, and Israel that have largely vaccinated their way out of the pandemic, but which will affect poor ones too. Post-COVID syndrome, to give it its formal name, is a set of symptoms affecting any part of the body that persist for at least 3 months after a bout of COVID-19. 3 stand out: breathlessness, fatigue, and brain fog. In Britain, 3 in every 5 people with long COVID say their usual activities are somewhat limited, and 1 in 5 says they are limited a lot, which often means being unable to do even a part-time desk-based job. The numbers are chilling. 500,000 people in Britain have had long COVID for more than 6 months. Their chances of full recovery are probably slim. The vast majority are in their working age prime. At the last count, which does not fully take in the country's second wave, 1.1% of Britain's population had had long COVID for at least 3 months, a group that includes 1.5% of those of working age. About 15% of Britain's population had been infected by then. Applying this rate to global COVID-19 cases, numbering an estimated 1.2 billion so far, suggests that more than 80 million people may already have long COVID. The costs of the condition have yet to be tallied, but they will be huge. Britain's National Institute for Health Research found that in 80% of sufferers, the illness affected the ability to work. Over a third said it had weighed on their finances. As yet, long COVID has no cure. What scientists know so far about the disease points to it being a combination of a persistent viral infection, for which a drug may be found at some point, a chronic autoimmune disorder, which would need expensive, complex care like that for rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, and lingering damage to some tissues caused by the original COVID-19 infection. Medicines for the first two of these causes may ultimately be found. America alone has put $1.15 billion into research. At the moment, though, sufferers need months of rehabilitation to help them cope. Healthcare systems and employers must prepare to assist long COVID sufferers, including those who have no proof of past infection because they were not able to be tested. Prompt rehabilitative care can prevent a downward spiral in personal health and finances. Dedicated long COVID clinics will speed things up. As things now stand, patients often bounce from one specialist to another in search of a diagnosis. Employers, for their part, must rethink how to accommodate workers with a disability that flares up in unpredictable bouts. Governments can help with incentives that encourage sufferers to stay in work and employers to cater to their condition. If governments miss the boat, millions of young and mid-career workers could permanently drop out of the labour force. One approach could draw on a scheme for disability benefits that is used in the Netherlands. Dutch employers and employees who are too unwell to work as normal are required to come up jointly with a plan on how the sick employee can return to work under new conditions. Remote working and flexible schedules would make it easier for long COVID sufferers to work at least part-time. Many of them will improve, though even that can take months. Lots of mistakes were made in the pandemic's acute phase. But that came out of the blue. There is no excuse for failing to respond to long COVID, and there is no time to waste.
Leaders.
America's economy. Biden's taxing problem. How to tax capital without hurting investment.
Governments raise most of their money by taxing wages, but President Joe Biden has his eyes fixed on the rich, big business, and Wall Street. He proposes to fund his $2.7 trillion infrastructure plan in part by raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. And to help pay for more spending on childcare and support for parents, he wants to roughly double the top rate of federal tax on capital gains and dividends. For Americans earning more than $1 million per year, he would bring levies on capital income into line with the top rate on wage income, which he wants to put up from 37% to 39.6%. That is about double the rate that is currently levied on rich investors, who are only a small fraction of the population, but a large proportion of shareholders. Many investors, from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, are up in arms, claiming that Mr. Biden will crush economic growth. That is an exaggeration. America can bear higher rates of capital taxation. Yet, levies on capital can have unintended economic consequences. If he is to avoid them, Mr. Biden should improve the design of his plans. Taxing savings and investment income can seem like unfair and inefficient double taxation. Those who earn today to spend today must pay only income and consumption taxes. Why should someone who prefers to gain by deferring their gratification face extra levies? Discouraging saving and investment hurts the economy in the long run, which is why a review in 2010 by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, ranked corporate taxes as the most harmful of 4 common taxes to economic growth. economic models predict that Mr. Biden's business tax plans would cut the size of America's economy by around 1% by 2050. Set against this is the scourge of tax avoidance. Tax capital lightly, and it pays to disguise wages as capital income, a particularly lucrative pastime for the rich. One problem is the carried interest loophole. It lets private equity and hedge fund managers class their fees as capital gains rather than income. Another issue is the explosive growth in pass-through firms, for example, partnerships, which accounted for more than half of American business income by 2011, up from about a fifth in 1980. Many capital-light, labor-intensive businesses, such as law firms, consultancies, and medical offices, are organized this way. Nearly half of the earnings that pass-through investors receive are classified as dividends and capital gains. Mr. Biden is right that bringing taxes on wages and capital into line would make tax avoidance harder. The trade-off between inefficiency and tax avoidance is painful, but two principles can help chart a sensible course. The first is to realize that taxes on capital stack up. Before they can return their profits to investors in the form of dividends and capital gains, firms pay corporate taxes. Whack up every capital levy to rates resembling income taxes, and you will take a larger bite out of investment income than out of wages. Shareholders in California, for example, face Mr. Biden's proposed 28% corporate tax rate, his 39.6% federal capital gains rate, a 13.3% state tax on capital gains, and a 3.8% levy on investment income introduced as part of Obamacare. They could, in theory, keep less than a third of their nominal returns under the Biden plan, and even less of their real returns, given that some of those taxes would be paid on the illusory capital gains generated by inflation. In reality, it is not as simple as compounding rates, because the corporate tax is leaky, and the current system, egregiously, waives capital gains taxes when assets are inherited. Still, after taking into account the revenues raised from closing loopholes, Mr. Biden should ensure that taxes on capital do not rise above taxes on labor. The second principle is to reduce inefficiency with allowances for investment. Exempting from capital taxation modest normal returns, which are usually measured by the interest rate on low-risk bonds, cuts distortions, as the normal return is in theory the minimum needed to make private sector projects worthwhile. The idea is baked into America's tax code for many types of investment, but only until the end of 2022. And Mr. Biden plans a new minimum tax on firms' accounting profits, which would interfere with the carve-out for the largest companies. Individual investors should also receive exemptions for the normal rate of return, which already happens in Norway and has been suggested in Britain by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. As Mr. Biden proposes, inheritances should not be exempt from capital gains tax. Genuine parity between capital and labor taxation, tempered by investment incentives, might not raise as much money as Mr. Biden's current plans. But such a reform would still help pay for his spending and reduce tax avoidance, without making the American tax system needlessly inefficient.
Leaders.
Hungary. Viktor Orban's University Challenge. The ruling party seizes control of Hungary's ivory towers.
A good university prizes original thought, and Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister, is certainly an original thinker. Since 2010, when his Fidesz party won 2/3 of the seats in parliament, he has been dreaming up innovative ways to turn Hungary back into an autocracy while maintaining a democratic facade. On April 27th, his government passed a law transferring control of the country's 11 main state universities to a series of foundations that are likely to be run by his allies. The party has already asserted its grip over institutions such as the electoral system, the media, the courts, and much of the economy. Now it wants total power over the ivory towers. Like most of Mr. Orbán's illiberal reforms, the plan is complicated, brilliant, and likely to be copied by aspiring strongmen in other countries. The universities have been placed under the control of public foundations, along with billions of euros worth of assets, including a palace, a harbour, and shares in state-owned companies, which are supposed to help finance them. The foundation's boards are initially appointed by Mr. Orbán's government, and those appointed so far consist mainly of Fidesz members or sympathisers. Subsequent vacancies will be filled by candidates chosen by the boards themselves. You might think that if Fidesz loses power, a new government could reorganise the foundations. But with its 2/3 supermajority in parliament, Fidesz has already written their governance rules into Hungary's constitution. Even if the opposition were to win next year's election, which is conceivable since the fractious parties have at last started to join forces, they would almost certainly lack enough seats to alter the constitution. In effect, Fidesz may just have granted itself control over Hungary's universities in virtual perpetuity. The government says the new system will let universities manage their own buildings and give them stable multi-year financing in place of annual state budgets. That is deceptive. Such administrative reorganisations were under discussion for years at several universities. The new law usurps those reforms, giving the new boards unlimited authority over the schools, the foundations, and their vast assets. The fear is that Fidesz will use this control as it has used control of the media to stifle dissenting voices and to churn out propaganda. Its hobby horses include the evils of immigration, liberalism, and gay and trans rights. It also spreads loopy conspiracy theories about the European Union and the financier George Soros' supposed plan to flood Hungary with Muslim immigrants. The government has already forced state universities to drop gender studies programs. It used legal harassment to force the Central European University, a formerly Budapest-based institution founded by Mr. Soros, that was a source of criticism of Mr. Orbán, to mostly decamp to Austria. Freedom House, a watchdog, rated Hungary as a fully free democracy in 2010. Its most recent report, published this week, lists it for the second year running as a hybrid regime, one step up from authoritarian. Hungary now scores worse than Serbia. What happens in Budapest does not stay in Budapest. Mr. Orbán's institution-nobbling ideas tend to spread. Poland's nationalist government has already mimicked Fidesz's takeovers of the media and of the courts. Populists in Croatia, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia have attempted similar tricks. France's Marine Le Pen is a fan of Mr. Orbán too. One reason why democracy is in decline around the world is that its enemies keep swapping tips on how to undermine it. If a political takeover of academia can happen in Hungary, a member of a club of rich, liberal democracies, it can happen anywhere. But being in the EU also provides means of resistance. After years of debate, the EU has adopted a rule of law mechanism. In principle, countries that trample legal principles can have their aid restricted. Compared with the size of its economy, Hungary was the biggest net beneficiary of EU funding in 2014 to 20, according to Bruegel, a think tank. True, cutting aid would be hard. The European Commission has been dragging its feet on establishing guidelines for doing so, and Hungary's allies, particularly Poland, will try to veto any such move. Nonetheless, it is long past time to act. For years, the EU has wearily accepted Hungary's ever more corrupt autocracy as if it were inevitable and bankrolled it lavishly. Instead, it should heed the words of a Hungarian academic, Géza Teleki, who warned that illiberal regimes want to abolish the autonomy of the universities because every autonomous group is naturally something they must get rid of. Teleki was testifying to America's Congress in 1954 about how Hungary's old Communist Party used to operate. Hungarians deserve better.
Leaders.
Hybrid diplomacy. The virtue of virtual. Diplomats have tried new tools during the pandemic. They should use them after it.
Before the pandemic, it might have been mistaken for an elaborate April Fool. The State Department announced that Antony Blinken would embark on his first virtual trip to Africa and engage with young people from across the continent. On April the 27th, the Secretary of State would travel virtually to Nigeria, meeting President Muhammadu Buhari before calling on President Uhuru Kenyatta to reaffirm America's strategic partnership with Kenya. He would then visit a few local renewable energy companies. What next? Summitry by hologram? But virtual diplomacy is no joke. It has kept international relations ticking over during the past year as travel became harder and face-to-face meetings often impossible. In the process, it has enlarged the diplomatic toolkit. Diplomats can make ample use of this in the post-pandemic future too. Many can't wait to get back to meeting in person, and rightly so. Over Zoom, even if the mute button doesn't play up, it is harder to build trust, the currency of diplomacy. It is easy to miss the subtle signs of body language, the twitch of an eyebrow, the curl of a lip, the uneasy shuffle that can be as eloquent as words. Proximity often makes all the difference. Having a seat next to Russia on the UN Security Council offers an excellent channel for conveying a message to President Vladimir Putin, such as "Don't invade Ukraine." The hardest agreements tend to be thrashed out in long sessions behind closed doors, helped by ideas floated in a corridor or a walk in the woods. With the best of intentions, Mr. Blinken's virtual trip to Africa cannot have the same impact as an actual visit by a statesman taking the trouble to travel and pay respects to faraway countries. Gradually, physical diplomacy will come back. In London on May the 3rd to the 5th, G7 foreign ministers are due to meet in person for the first time in more than 2 years with the help of daily COVID testing and suitable social distancing. In June, G7 leaders plan to gather in Cornwall, and a physical NATO summit will follow in Brussels. The trip to Europe is penciled in as President Joe Biden's first foreign foray as president. It would be wrong to assume that diplomacy will simply return to business as usual, however. For one thing, virtual diplomacy has proved that it can be highly efficient. Mr. Biden, for example, has been able to zip around the world without leaving the White House, joining European leaders on screen in Munich and Asian leaders in a cyber summit of the Indo-Pacific Quad. He was able to bring together dozens of world leaders for a deep green climate gathering on Earth Day. The UN General Assembly and other big diplomatic jamborees could happily be scaled back in future, as much of their routine business can be done perfectly well online. Sometimes, for tricky negotiations' sake, it will make sense to conduct business in person. Sometimes virtual meetings will be more practical and productive. Diplomacy will go hybrid. That could allow it to be more inclusive. The pandemic has intensified experiments in bringing a wider range of voices to conflict resolution. In the physical world, arranging for groups of women or young people from a troubled country to meet in a safe place is a logistical nightmare. Using a digital platform, as the UN discovered in Libya and Yemen, it is relatively simple. Broad participation in digital dialogues can counter the criticism that a peace process is a top-down stitch-up and lend greater legitimacy to any agreement reached, giving it a better chance of working. Even old hands are excited about the promise of industrial levels of inclusion. This should become a standard part of peace formulas. In the 19th century, the telegraph shrank the time needed to contact envoys. In the 20th century, the jet plane shrank distance. Now, digital platforms are supplanting physical presence. Used wisely, diplomacy will be the better for it.
Letters.
On money laundering, voting in Georgia, European TV, Ebenezer Howard, and simplifying.
Fight the good fight.
From Scott Lyles, President, Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, Columbus, Ohio. The war against money laundering is not lost, it continues, and we should not wave the white flag just when its most promising strategies are gaining ground. Article Losing the War, April 17th. One such strategy is enforcement. The fact that last year banks had to pay $10.4 billion in anti-money laundering or AML fines could be seen as a failure to stop illicit flows. But it also reflects a greater willingness to crack down on violations outside the United States. And although forming AML teams has indeed been a Herculean task, imposing big regulatory changes on firms across the world is no easy feat. Such investments are not aimed at the problems of the past, but at the future. Technological advances, such as artificial intelligence, are only now beginning to fortify the compliance controls developed over previous decades. More work is needed, including by governments. For one, financial supervisors should rethink punitive policies that largely leave institutions in the defensive posture of meeting technical obligations rather than focusing solely on rooting out illicit funds. Efforts to bring together investigators, supervisors and compliance officers in mission-driven task forces are now starting to bear fruit.
From Avinash Persaud, Emeritus Professor of Gresham College, London. Big companies and big countries prefer to be judged on process over results. The leading centres of money laundering are London, New York, Shanghai, and other big financial centres. These hubs and their regulators tick the right boxes on processes and never appear on official money laundering blacklists that trigger sanctions. Professional money launderers want to hide in a crowd of similar transactions, yet countries that are labelled as threats include the likes of Cuba, Vanuatu and Yemen. Many have exchange controls. Some don't even have an international bank. These are the last places you will find big money launderers. They are blacklisted and do not have the political influence to get off. The politicisation of AML lists is dangerously creating a safe tunnel for such criminals, who are good at getting around prescriptive processes. Switching the focus to heavy sanctions for actual money laundering instead of tick-box exercises on applied process would harness the private sector's ingenuity to win this important war.
From Jan Kleijsen, Director, Information Society and Action Against Crime, Council of Europe, Strasbourg. As your article noted, outsourcing policing functions to the private sector may be problematic. Instead, enhancing the powers of financial intelligence units to monitor and even postpone suspicious transactions may be a more efficient measure and would be fully compliant with countries' legal obligations. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recently passed a resolution urging governments in Europe and beyond to do just that.
Georgia's election laws.
Robert Lee, Dallas, Georgia. As a professional engaged in the industry of electioneering in Georgia, I wanted to provide some context to the reforms in the Election Integrity Act, article Not So Peachy, April 3rd. Of notable importance is the environment in which those reforms took place. After the governor's election of 2018, which Stacey Abrams wrongly claimed was stolen from her, Georgia replaced an election system that was dated, susceptible to security breaches, and lacking a paper trail. The overhaul of equipment brought significant change in how votes were counted, local election officials were trained, and voters verified. Although the system was tested locally, no statewide election had occurred before the pandemic in 2020. Last year's public health orders highlighted significant cracks in its implementation, staff training, and voter verification. The system didn't anticipate millions of people voting at a distance, demonstrating the unreliability of signature matching technology. Boxes to drop ballots in, popular among Republicans and Democrats alike, were not even legal. They only existed because of gubernatorial fiat. None of this is to suggest that nefarious activities took place. As a Republican, I challenge anyone to prove elections were stolen. Democrats performed meekly in state-level offices when they thought they'd win the state house. They didn't even come close. Their cries of voter suppression are naked partisan gimmicks designed to rile their base for a competitive election in 2022.
Europe's TV beats the invaders.
From Vanessa O'Connor, Director of Member Relations and Communications, European Broadcasting Union, Geneva. How appropriate that Charlemagne should choose barbarians to illustrate his notion that Netflix is creating a common European culture, April 3rd. That show, made in Germany, portrays the efforts of Rome as a supposedly superior and sophisticated imperial invader to impose its laws and manners on apparently uncivilized barbarians, the Greeks termed barbaroi for anyone who did not speak Greek. Memories are short. It has been only a few years since series like The Bridge hit screens through European TV networks, creating a huge internal market of European programmes, subtitled or dubbed. In addition, some of Europe's leading networks are collaborating on high-end drama, such as Leonardo. Looking at Europe's public broadcasters alone, annual investment in content is just shy of €20 billion. That's $24 billion a year.
Ebenezer Good.
From David Natzler, Clerk of the House of Commons, 2015 to 19, London. Your piece on Welwyn Garden City describes Sir Ebenezer Howard as a farmer turned urban visionary. Article, Paved Paradise, April 17th. A visionary indeed, but not really a farmer. Howard spent a few months as a young man farming in Nebraska, but then trained as a stenographer in Chicago and spent his entire professional life thereafter in London as a parliamentary reporter with phenomenally fast shorthand, in essence, a forerunner of today's Hansard reporters. Maybe there is something about listening intently to parliamentarians that encourages visionary thinking.
Clear your mind.
From Jason Gart, Rockville, Maryland. The article on people's tendency to add things when improving something rather than simplifying them, article Less is Often More, April 17th, reminded me of Lao Tzu, an ancient Chinese philosopher. He observed that to attain knowledge, add things every day. To attain wisdom, remove things every day.
From John Allen Smith, New York. When it comes to solving problems, creating a subpar result is surely an improvement for a golf course.
Briefing.
The Economist, May 1st to May 7th, 2021. In the briefing section, China and Taiwan. Something wicked this way comes.
Briefing.
China and Taiwan. Something wicked this way comes. America is increasingly concerned about the possibility of war in the Taiwan Strait. It has good reason.
On June 29, 1950, the USS Valley Forge, flagship of America's 7th Fleet, passed through the Taiwan Strait. A battle group defended her flanks, America's first naval jets sat in her hangar, and a new vision of American-dominated Asian security unfurled in her wake. Only a few months before, America's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, had declared that the Asian peoples are on their own and know it. But on June 25th, Stalinist North Korea launched an invasion of its southern neighbour, and a country confronting communism could no longer leave Asia alone. America would fight with South Korea. It was to join in that defence that the Valley Forge was steaming north from Subic Bay. Her route had added purpose. Containing Asian communism meant more than fighting North Korea. It also required making sure that Mao Zedong, mainland China's ruler since the previous year, did not take the island of Taiwan from the nationalist regime led by Chiang Kai-shek, who had been forced to retreat there. On June 27th, President Harry Truman announced a new Taiwan policy. America would defend the island from attack. The nationalists must, for their part, cease air and sea operations against the mainland. The 7th Fleet will see that this is done, the President declared, with nicely laconic menace, hence the Valley Forge's show of strength. From that week on, to the relief of some and the frustration of others, Asian peoples were no longer on their own. The Korean War transformed the region into a theatre of ideological struggle just as fraught as divided Cold War Europe. For nearly 3 decades, the Taiwan Strait saw ships of the 7th Fleet acting as a tripwire between the two Chinas. There were early battles over outlying islands, including a crisis in 1958 in which Mao's brinkmanship nearly started a nuclear war. But over time, the rivals to the west and east of the strait settled into an uneasy half-peace, both adamant that they were the one true China, neither able to act on the conviction. Over time, Taiwan became the prosperous pro-Western democracy of 24 million people which it is today. While the mainland saw traditions and social codes destroyed by Maoist fanaticism, Taiwan has a rich religious and cultural life. It has come to enjoy raucous free speech and a marked liberal streak. It was the first Asian country to legalise gay marriage. A generation ago, it could matter greatly whether someone's grandparents had arrived from the mainland in 1949 or had deeper roots on the island. That has now changed, especially among the young. In 2020, a poll by the Pew Research Center, a Washington-based research outfit, found that about 2/3 of adults on the island now identified as purely Taiwanese. About 3 in 10 called themselves both Taiwanese and Chinese. Just 4% called themselves simply Chinese. Leaders in Beijing differ. They consider them all Chinese. They tell their own people that most citizens of Taiwan agree and that the historical necessity of national unification is being thwarted by secessionist troublemakers egged on by America. Once Taiwan was a point of compromise between the two powers. On January 1st, 1979, the day that America recognized the People's Republic of China, the economic reformers running the mainland changed their Taiwan policy from armed liberation to peaceful reunification, soon afterwards adding a promise of considerable autonomy, one country, two systems. But for the past 25 years, that conciliatory offer has been accompanied by an unprecedented military build-up. In recent years, China's rhetoric towards Taiwan has sounded new notes of impatience, and the crushing abnegation of its promise to observe one country, two systems in Hong Kong over the past 2 years has deepened Taiwanese distrust. Last year, the issue helped Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, to be re-elected president. In principle, the DPP favours the creation of a Taiwan that is formally its own nation, but to declare independence in that way would trigger massive Chinese reprisals. To keep that crisis at bay, Ms. Tsai, a moderate cat-loving academic, relies on an artful diplomatic dodge, that she governs a country which, while proudly Taiwanese, uses the legal name of the Republic of China, which it inherited from the nationalists who arrived in 1949. China's leaders detest her. The passage of time poses a dilemma for China. Every year, China's ability to coerce Taiwan economically and militarily grows greater, and every year it loses more hearts and minds on Taiwan. Should rulers in Beijing ever conclude that peaceful unification is a hopeless cause, Chinese law instructs them to use force. This dynamic alarms the heirs to Acheson. Though the Accord of 1979 cast Taiwan into non-state limbo, the island's security remained as a matter of American law, a question of grave concern. When in 1996 China sought to intimidate the Taiwanese about to vote in their first free presidential election by means of missile tests, President Bill Clinton ordered the USS Nimitz, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and her attendant battle group to pass through the strait. The missile tests stopped. American military commanders are increasingly open about their concerns that in the context of Taiwan, the balance of military power between China and America has swung in China's direction. A 25-year campaign of shipbuilding and weapons procurement, begun in direct response to the humiliation of 1996, has provided the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, a fleet of 360 ships, according to American naval intelligence, compared with America's 297. On April 23rd, state media hailed the symbolism of a ceremony in which China's supreme leader, President Xi Jinping, commissioned 3 large warships on the same day: a destroyer, a helicopter carrier, and a ballistic missile submarine. The second of these is ideal for airlifting troops to a mountainous island, the media noted with glee. The third is a way of deterring superpowers. America still boasts more, better carriers and nuclear submarines. It has much more experience of far-flung operations, and it has allies too. But America's forces have global duties. China would be fighting close to home and thus enjoying the benefit of the PLA's land-based aircraft and missiles. Lonnie Henley, who was until 2019 the chief Pentagon intelligence analyst for East Asia, sees the radars and missiles of the integrated air defense system along China's coast as the center of gravity of any war over Taiwan. Unless those defences are destroyed, American forces would be limited to long-range weapons or attacks by the stealthiest warplanes, Mr. Henley told a congressional panel in February. But destroying those defences would mean one nuclear power launching direct attacks on the territory of another. And the Chinese build-up continues apace. History is an imperfect guide, but offers precedents to ponder, says a senior American defense official. The world has never seen a military expansion of this scale, not associated with conflict. It is not just a matter of numbers. China has carefully focused its efforts on the ability to defeat American forces that might trouble it. It has missiles designed expressly for killing carriers and others that would allow precision strikes on the American base on Guam. The defense official lists other fields in which China has worked to neutralize areas of American strength, whether that means investment in anti-submarine weapons and sensors, or systems to jam or destroy the satellites on which American forces rely. Copying an American method, China has set up a training center with a professional opposing force that mimics enemy, in this case American, doctrines and tactics. The head of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, told a Senate hearing in March that China's fielding of new warships, planes and rockets, when considered alongside the regime's unblushing readiness to crush dissent from Hong Kong to Tibet, makes him worry that China is accelerating its apparent ambitions to supplant America and its allies from their position atop what he called the rules-based international order, a phrase that China sees as code for Western hegemony. Pondering the specific risks of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, the Admiral told senators that the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact in the next 6 years. Admiral John Aquilino, nominated to be Admiral Davidson's successor as head of Indo-Pacific Command, told a confirmation hearing in March that work to shore up America's ability to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan is urgent. While he stopped short of endorsing his predecessor's timeline of 6 years, he called the prospect of a Chinese use of force much closer to us than most think. Anxiety has been raised further by war games involving Taiwan scenarios, both secret and unclassified, that were won by officers, spooks, or scholars playing the role of China. The Admiral's worries mix judgments about China's capabilities with hunches about its intent. Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund, a public policy outfit, notes that their mission is to make plans, in this case to win a war over Taiwan. Once they realize that victory may elude them or may only be possible at great cost, panic is understandable. That does not mean they are correctly assessing China's incentives to act soon. Strikingly, some of the intelligence officers paid to analyse the world for admirals and generals are noticeably calmer. The trends are not ideal from a Chinese perspective, says Mr. Henley. But are they tolerable? I just don't see them being in that grim a mindset. A broader American angst is driven by the knowledge of what defeat would mean. Neil Ferguson, a historian, recently wrote that the fall of Taiwan to China would be seen around Asia as the end of American predominance and even as America's Suez, a reference to the humbling of Britain when it overreached during the Suez Crisis of 1956. Asked about this idea in early April, Matt Pottinger, who was head of Asia policy in the Trump White House, agreed and added another reason for Asian allies to fear such a public loss of American credibility. When Britain stumbled at Suez, America had already taken its place as the leader of the Western world, Mr. Pottinger told a Hoover Institution podcast. Today, he observed, there's not another United States waiting in the wings. For all its newfound strength, China faces daunting odds. A full-scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan, a mountainous island that lies across at least 130 kilometers of water, would be the most ambitious such venture since the Second World War. America has spent years nagging its Taiwanese allies to capitalize on their natural insular advantages, for instance by buying lots of naval mines, drones and coastal defense cruise missiles on mobile launchers to sink Chinese troop ships, rather than continuing to splurge on tanks and F-16 fighters. Randall Shriver, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in 2018-19, promoted efforts to help Taiwan disable Chinese radar and other sensors. If we are able to just blind the PLA, that would be a huge contribution to the fight. If a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan were to fail, or military conflict to reach a stalemate, would it fight on? Outsiders offer no consensus. Mr. Henley suggests that a failed invasion might evolve into a long-term blockade, a strategy to which Western defence planners are paying increasing attention. There is a much-heard view that once China starts fighting, anything short of victory would mean regime-toppling humiliation. But Mr. Shriver is sceptical. This is part of Beijing's win-without-fighting strategy, to make everyone believe that they climb the escalation ladder all the way to nukes if they have to. The risks and costs of war, even a successful one, bring home the point that capabilities in themselves are never the determining factor. Intentions matter too, and are far more opaque, especially when, as in China, they reside largely in the mind of one man. It is common to hear Western analysts state that Mr. Xi has staked his legacy and legitimacy on Taiwan's return. Hard evidence for this alarming belief is in short supply. The most cited is that in a New Year speech in 2019, he linked union with Taiwan to the ambition that he has placed at the core of his leadership, namely the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He also repeated what he had said to a Taiwanese envoy in 2013, that cross-strait differences should not be passed from generation to generation. Having abolished the term limit on his role as president in 2018, 67-year-old Mr. Xi can hardly expect to be succeeded by another member of his generation. Following his own logic, it thus falls to him to make sure that the task is not passed on. In an October 2019 meeting in Beijing, Chinese scholars and military experts shared with Oriana Schuyler Mastro of Stanford University their understanding that it is imperative for Taiwan to be recovered during Mr. Xi's time as leader. Though some semi-official Chinese commentators already say that they see no hope for unification without some use of violence, there is no agreement among foreign governments as to whether that is the settled view of China's rulers. China continues to try to shape Taiwanese opinion with a mix of sticks and carrots, which suggests that negotiation has not been abandoned. The biggest carrot, access to its vast markets, continues to be dangled in front of Taiwanese business interests. Ms. Glazer notes that Mr. Xi sounded a patient note in March when he visited Fujian, the coastal province nearest to Taiwan, urging officials to explore new paths of cross-strait integration and economic development. But China's carrots and sticks can clash. To punish the Taiwanese for electing a DPP government, China has reduced official and semi-official cross-strait contacts to nearly zero, says Andrew Nguyen Zhu-yang, a former Taiwanese deputy defense minister, now at the Chinese Council of Advanced Policy Studies, a think tank in Taipei. That raises the danger of misunderstandings. So does China's increased military activity around the island. Psychological operations and grey zone warfare have been intensifying. In 2020, according to Taiwan's government, Chinese warplanes made 380 sorties into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, a buffer zone of international airspace where foreign planes face questioning by controllers and potential interception by Taiwanese fighters. Such a tempo of operations has not been seen since 1996. On April 5th, the Chinese Navy promised patrols by its aircraft carriers around Taiwan on a regular basis. On April 12th, 25 Chinese planes entered the ADIZ, a record for a single day. This may be a test of the new Biden administration, says a senior Taiwanese diplomat, or a bid to create a new normal in which Chinese forces are routinely present in a zone formerly controlled by Taiwan. China knows that Taiwan will not fire first, so the Chinese will continue to push, the diplomat says. The constant incursions wear down Taiwanese defences, raise the chances of accidental collisions, and would make it harder to spot a rush to real war. Beyond the constant drumbeat of military pressure, China is trying to divide society, trying to sow the seeds of chaos, says the diplomat. They also conduct cyber activities and disinformation campaigns. Wang Zaishi, a former deputy head of the Association for Relations across the Taiwan Straits, a semi-official Chinese body, advocates a third way between all-out war and political negotiations, one in which a massive display of firepower cows Taiwan into submission. In Chinese media interviews, he has cited the not wholly reassuring precedent of Red Army troops surrounding Beijing in 1949 in such intimidating numbers that the city fell with rather few casualties, an approach he calls using war to force peace. In some polls, less than half of Taiwanese say they would fight in a war with China or want relatives to do so. Compulsory military service was sharply reduced in 2013 by a government keen on closer ties with China. If the island loses more than half of its defences in the first waves of an attack, the public's will to fight might collapse, frets Mr. Young. A swift collapse would make America's position yet harder. If American reinforcements arrive to find China's troops already on the island, asks Ms. Skylar Mastro, can they start firing if no Chinese unit has shot at Americans? I think that would be a very hard call for a US president to make. If the Taiwanese appetite for a fight is unclear, so too is America's. Taiwan's government is painfully aware that preserving their friendly, successful democracy is not in itself a vital national interest for anyone else. Instead, Taiwanese officials stress the extraordinary importance of the island's semiconductor industry to global supply chains. They also emphasize how grim and frightening the Asia-Pacific would feel if America ever broke its commitments and ducked a fight with China. Japan's Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide recently went further than any recent predecessor when he mentioned the importance of stability in the Taiwan Strait in a joint statement with Mr. Biden. Japan fears Taiwan becoming a Chinese bastion just to its south, explains Mikishita Narushiga of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. But it also has much to lose if America is chased out of the Pacific. If the fall of Taiwan means the disengagement of the US from this region, that would be a vital interest. Some in America want to make clear that maintaining its Asian role is central to America's interests too. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, a Democrat close to Mr. Biden, is co-sponsor of the Strategic Competition Act, a bill with strong bipartisan support that would deepen ties with Taiwan, whether by offering the island trade deals, weapons sales, expanded contracts with American officials, or support in its attempts to take part in international forums, as one of several measures to push back against what he calls China's growing global aggression. To explain the island's importance to voters, he talks of how dependent modern life is on the chips it makes. He also cites the importance of America being seen to keep its word and linking arms with allies to counter China, rather than trying to lead the world through bluster. It may sound a bit narcissistic for Americans to assume that China's plans for Taiwan turn on how strong America looks to China, but Chinese experts and officials are sincerely convinced that America is delighted to be Taiwan's security guarantor and thus gain a chance to meddle in China's internal affairs. Without America to help, Taiwan will surrender in an instant, they argue, rather as Mr. Yang fears. Their disdain for the idea that China might try to win over Taiwanese hearts and minds can be chilling. Unification will not be decided by Taiwan's playhouse politics, but by geopolitical power struggles, Zhu Feng of Nanjing University told an annual forum run by the Global Times, a jingoistic party newspaper. Ni Lezhong, a Taiwan expert at Shanghai University of Political Science and Law, says that bellicose commentaries in the state media must, in some limited sense, enjoy official sanction. Such commentators would be too scared to write about such things without approval, he says. But he scoffs at Westerners who worry that Chinese leaders may feel compelled by the nationalism which such screeds stoke in the public. The views of the masses will not decide what happens, he says. The key is military power. There is much to be said for America's decades-long policy of strategic ambiguity. Though some American scholars believe it would usefully deter China to hear the Biden administration say it would join any war over Taiwan, it could also provoke China to rash acts or embolden some future leader on Taiwan to declare independence. Logic also supports the Pentagon's desire to spend the next 10 years arming Taiwan, buying new weapons, and thus increasing the uncertainty of Chinese commanders and their political masters. The challenge of such an approach is to generate enough anxiety to stay China's hand, but not so much that Mr. Xi sees Taiwan slipping permanently from his grasp. For all the alarm in Washington, China does not feel like a country on a war footing or particularly close to one. Several sources briefed on a recent meeting in Alaska between China's top foreign policy officials Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi and the Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan report that the Chinese delivered shrill and inflexible talking points on Taiwan, but used no new language that showed unprecedented urgency. China's public stance involves much saber-rattling, to be sure. Viewers of state television are never far from their next sight of an aircraft carrier or gleaming jets screaming through azure skies. But calls for sacrifice to prepare the public for full-on hostilities are missing. The party's claims to legitimacy in this, its centenary year, are overwhelmingly domestic and based on order and material prosperity. They are buttressed by images of gorge-spanning bridges and high-speed trains, villagers raised from poverty and heroic doctors beating back COVID-19 even as it rages around the outside world. Nevertheless, China's visible capabilities and veiled intent are grounds for alarm. Its scorn for Western opinion, as over Hong Kong, is a bad sign. War over Taiwan may not appear imminent in Beijing, but nor, shockingly, is it unthinkable.